Hindol Sengupta. With me is Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev Sanyal is a well-known author, of course, and of course, he is a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. But Sanjeev Sanyal really, in his heart, is a man of many, many professions, so to speak, and many, many interests. So we'll have a broad, wide-ranging conversation with him. Sanjeev, thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Sanjeev, let me begin by asking you, you wrote a wonderful new book on revolutionaries and the revolutionary history of India, which we all read with great interest. There are revolutionary things happening in India's current position in the world too, and you write about that too. So I'm going to try and connect these two themes and talk about a wider revolution as far as India is concerned. And let me begin by one theme that you touch upon quite extensively in the recent past, which is India's ranking in various indices. It could be its, market rating, it could be its bond rating, it could be on various global indices, democracy rating. You speak quite proficiently and have spoken quite proficiently about this. Take us through your thought on this, because there does seem to be a big problem in this.
So my interest in this really came from investigating India's sovereign ratings. So if you went by any objective criteria, India should be at least one, probably two ratings above where it is right now. So the question is, why aren't we rated more highly? And the reason for that is very simple. You see, about 20% of the weightage, roughly speaking, of most sovereign ratings is based on subjective factors. And the rating agencies don't quite tell you what they are, but because I'm from that industry, I know roughly where they come from. So what they do is they use various things, like, for example, the World Bank's World Governance Indicator, for example, as a proxy for things like political stability, governance, and those kinds of fuzzy, subjective things. Now, this affects our sovereign ratings because, 20% ratings on this, and India oddly does badly on them relative to what I would think would be the case, given the fact that we are a well-established democracy, well-established and regulated financial markets. We are not sort of a newbie in many of the things you would think that sovereign ratings would care about in terms of our ability to repay debt. Ultimately, that's what you care about. So I decided to investigate the matter. So where do all these world governance indicator of the World Bank come from, for example? So I dug into it and discovered something very interesting. If you go into the World Bank's World Governance Indicator page yourself, you will see that after telling us what all those indicators are and ranking them and so on, it is actually doesn't belong to the World Bank at all. In fact, there is a disclaimer at the bottom saying that there are two random economists who are actually responsible for it, and the World Bank does not speak up for it at all. So I began to dig into this further and said, this is very odd. Why does the World Bank have in its website this indicator? And nobody seems to take ownership of this. Certainly the World Bank doesn't. And yet it's given the legitimacy of being on their website. So I dug in and discovered that basically this World Governance Indicator is a weighted average of some sort of further indices. So I looked into these indices. What were they? And by the way, I'm talking about World Bank's World Governance Indicator, but there are many such things. And so basically, layer by layer, there are all these other indices, which sometimes are basically weighted averages of further indices and so on and so forth. So it began to remind me a little bit of the way in which money laundering is done. Layer on layer accounts, you lose track of what's going on. So in the same way, you have these huge, ecosystem of indices. And so there is, for example, varieties of democracy index in Sweden, and then there is Freedom House and so on. And it is quite strange that no matter what the indices is, India does conspicuously badly on all of them. So, for example, there was 1 year, I think in 2022, where India's academic freedom was below that of Afghanistan. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. And then recently also you had I think it was the reporter Sans Frontier or somebody who came out with the Media Freedom Index for India. And we were below obviously, dysfunctional countries like Pakistan and so on. In many other areas also, for example, happiness index, what on earth is happiness? But it turns out we are even less happy than Ukraine and Palestine. So there is obviously a problem. And it is politically driven quite clearly, because if you read some of those reports, they're all tilted in a particular political way. So I dug through even further and discovered that, look, there are actually all of them, no matter how many of them they exist, they actually are funded by the same 4-5 institutions. All of them are some kind of billionaire foundation based in the North Atlantic, and one or two government sources like State Department, for example, entirely fund the US State Department and US government basically entirely funds the Freedom House. And so they in turn use US CRIF reports, which are in also government. So, there's either a bunch of tiny number of billionaire foundations and one or two governments. The EU, European Union, has also a source of this. So basically, the North Atlantic gives out certificates to various people. These certificates are in various combinations, given weighted averages. And then they further are given legitimacy by the World Bank by putting on their page this World Governance Indicator, for which they have this sly, disclaimer at the bottom of the page saying that actually it's not there. So there is nobody looking after all of this. And these are all opinions. That's the best part. I mean, I looked through the methodologies of this. I've published papers on this also. They are usually the opinions of, between 5 and 30 people. I mean, even your college elections, a survey of 30 people wouldn't be a statistically significant thing. And they are ranking whole countries based on this. So this is obvious garbage. So I began talking about it and making a fuss about it. And, I thought there'd be some deep pushback that will come, where my methodologies or the things I'm talking about would be really picked apart. But then I discovered that nobody has done it. And I'm now been on this path for some time, some years. And frankly, nobody has given me any decent answers to any of the questions I've raised. So here we are in 2024, and I'm still asking the same questions. In fact, some people have asked the directors on these institutions, please explain how you come up with these numbers and explain the questions I raised. And there was the director of Varieties of Democracy Institute in Stockholm, who was asked questions. There's some mad economist in India who has raised all these questions. Can you answer it? And he just dismisses it with the most bizarre of answers. He said, oh my God, our indices is based on supercomputers cranking out on these complex models and high mathematics. You've got to be kidding me. I mean, these are opinions of 30 people. I mean, you can easily do it on an Excel sheet. But for some reason, he thought, he would somehow manage to intimidate Indians by mentioning complex mathematics and computers. I have no idea why. But this is the level of idiocy that we are dealing with. But the reason I'm bringing it up is that they have real world implications. So in the past, I may have just dismissed these and said, these are crackpots, but they have real life implications. They are quoted by various groups. You now have an entirely new scam called the Environment, Social and Governance norms, the ESG norms, which are being hardwired by various regulators in the world. So this nonsense is getting hardwired into real life. And so I thought I should raise my
So
voice.
we'll come to ESG in just a moment, and I want to ask you a few things about what you think about CBAM and many other things which are really heating up. But let me come to the core argument first. And I had a past life as a journalist, so this is particularly interesting. You're essentially saying it's a bit like foreign correspondents would come and land in Delhi and talk to 10 people, usually people they knew, usually at a Tory bar in Delhi or something like that, or somebody's house, and they would write these voluminous articles about this is the state of India. You're essentially saying that it's a bit like a Ponzi scheme. It keeps quoting other people who have done very similar things. So if you keep unraveling that thread, if you keep digging deeper and deeper, you see that it all goes back to the same bunch of people mentioning various things to the same kind of
Not just
organizations.
that. These studies and these institutes are all funded by these same people.
Mm.
So Soros's Open Society funds half of these think tanks. You will find Rockefeller and Ford Foundation being other there, or you will find U.S. government. So there are a couple of European Union institutions that also do this. So there are a very small group of people who are essentially, funding another bunch of institutions who are doing this, and so it's a Ponzi scheme. And that there are a large number of people and large number of institutions which have this view, but in fact, it's the views of a very, very small coterie who will then use the same quotes and write, so their opinion will be, instead of quoting them like in the old style journalism, their opinions will be put into something called an index, as if it is more objective as a result. And then these same people will quote the index in which their opinions are incorporated. So it's a circular thing. So you'll write an article for Nature, quote the whatever the VDEMS index, but the VDEMS index is actually based on the same person's opinions. It's these kinds of things happen.
Talk a little bit about the so-called green laws in Europe. A lot of debate about it, including laws like CBAM and their impact. The Europeans make an argument, and you were at ORF, I was at ORF. We heard many European voices talk about, at Raisina Dialogue, at ORF's Raisina Dialogue, talk about how, in a sense, there is a lot of concern also, not just in India, but in other parts of Asia. And, in fact, perhaps, China would land up using these things in a different sort of way. So there seems to be a lot of complexity. I want you to talk about a little bit in detail about how you see these so-called green laws, especially CBAM and a bunch of other, the deforestation law, and so on and so forth.
See, these things all started out, the whole ESG ecosystem of things started out with something quite innocuous. It appeared in a paper in 2006, this idea of having environmental, social, and governance norms, ESG norms. And now that, who can argue against having some sort of a thing? Even I'm in favor of it. But it was not defined. So then that was the end of that. But over time, what happened? Whole bunch of institutions, by the way, includes many of these institutes and NGOs that I was talking about earlier. So some of them are there, but now it will also include, the big four consultancies, etc., who also now do. They began to put numbers around these things and define what is good governance, what is good social indicator. And now, obviously, these are all subjective. Now, I'm okay if at least they had a discussion with a wider group of people before imposing them. In fact, what happened is that random people came up with whatever suited them. Now, as long as it was voluntary, it was fine. But these things are no longer voluntary. So now what is happening? The European Union is imposing not just on itself, but on the wider world, because now they're going to impose it on imports and other investments and so on. These things which were never discussed. So our exports will be subjected to it without any discussion with us, whether or not these are fair. And by the way, many of these things are quite suspect because very often they involve technologies where the Europeans themselves own the patents. So effectively what they are doing is that they are saying that if you export to us, you have to pay us a jizya tax by using our patent, or you have to get a certification of some sort from us. So these are all various ways of squeezing the system. Now, it is not the case that they themselves aren't paying a price for this, because there is, and obviously here, all kinds of manipulation can happen. So you have the absurd thing that I think Elon Musk or somebody pointed out, that the best ESG ratings are actually derived by tobacco companies. So they'll take points for the fact that they are using a renewable, which is tobacco, which is evidently absorbing CO2 from the air in order to grow, and they'll put a few minority faces into their board or whatever, and then claim that this is a fantastic example of corporate governance. So this kind of garbage will happen. And naturally, moment you allow for subjective systems, it will allow for some sort of a license permit Raj will lead to manipulation.
This deeply connects to, the underlying economic power structures moving in the world, because all of this is connected to trade, all of this is connected to, various kinds of, economic interactions between countries. And, many people believe, and I wonder what you think about this, that, countries that are losing, in a sense, steam as far as being able to effectively compete. Canada comes to mind. Ruchi Sharma has written that Canada is, one of those countries which is essentially going down, right? It's not a breakout nation, it's a breakdown nation. Many of these countries are trying to hold on to such norms to ensure that they build or try and build some sort of fortress, because they can no longer effectively deliver the economics that they need.
Absolutely. They are doing two things. First of all, they can't compete any longer on any efficiency ground. So this is a obvious way of creating a fortress. The second part is that, remember, these countries also have memories of glory times when they were colonial powers. So they are also, in some ways, trying to resurrect a time when they basically told the rest of the world how to behave themselves. So there is a strong element of neo-colonial sort of attitude that is a part of this conversation.
Course, a little bit, because all of this also connects to this, this other sort of attribute, which is, hugely debated now, the DEI, the diversity sort of criteria. Increasingly, that also was so loosely defined that in the West, MIT has just come out with the statement, for instance, that it will no longer require DEI declarations in many of its documents. And, we can see in the West, for instance, in America and other parts, what loosely defining these things have done. Now, again, like you said, who can deny and who would not agree that, okay, there has to be more diversity in our society and in our workplace? But it all depends on how you define them. Talk to us a little bit about
Not
whether
just,
you see that coming into India, or is there an impact?
no, so you see, when it didn't suit their own agenda, they are happy to unwind it.
Yeah.
But the problem here is that then why does the same logic not apply to all these trade barriers that they are introducing? In fact, they've done it repeatedly. So when it didn't suit Germany, suddenly coal became a reasonably green thing when they suddenly began to open their mines and dig out coal because they could no longer import Russian gas. We have seen this kind of thing happening very recently. Many, many green things suddenly were, that entire list was expanded to take in things that were earlier deemed not to be green just because it was now politically and economically more expedient. So, there has to be a degree of sensibleness on all of this. And here in India, we want to do the right thing. It's not like we want to grow by, burning coal and all this kind of thing. In any case, the fact of the matter is we are a hydrocarbons poor country. So we, really want to move away from hydrocarbons for no other reason, but because we don't have very much of it. We have to import all of it. So we want to become solar. We want to do these other things. But it is being made difficult by introducing rules and defining them in ways that suits their purpose rather than the actual purpose, which should be surely to try and allow India to grow and do it in ways that suit our climate or our resources and our technology. And by the way, there is in the Paris Agreement, significant discussion about sharing technologies. And frankly, we see no such thing happening. Why shouldn't all these green technologies, patents be all shared freely, if that is what they really want?
Talk a little bit also about, because you touched upon something that correlates to innovation, right? Finally, at the end of the day, these are technologies being born of innovation, and you recently wrote about the condition of innovation in India compared to other parts of the world. You mentioned the US, you mentioned China, you mentioned what all India could do to further the cause of innovation. Talk to us a little bit about that. Where do you stand on such an issue?
So India needs to become a much more innovative country. There's no doubt about it. You go to anywhere, labs around the world, particularly in the US, and we find it's full of Indian engineers and scientists and so on. So Indians are by nature very innovative. The question is, why aren't we doing that level of cutting edge innovation in India? Now, there are many reasons for this. I'm going to focus on the issue of patenting. So if you look at our patenting regime, till not so long ago, that 16, 17, we were not even doing 10,000 patents a year. Now, in the context where the US is doing 350,000 patents a year, and China is doing 700,000 patents a year, but although China's number is rated by something called utility patent, but even then, point is they're in a different scale, and we weren't even doing 10,000, 10,000 compared to lakhs. So, we began to do some improvement, and so there was some, slow improvement over the subsequent years. But a few years ago, you may remember, I wrote a paper from Economic Advisory Council to PM working paper, in which I picked apart the patenting ecosystem and said, these are the whole bunch of rules, regulations, processes to be changed. You need more people. You need the whole bunch of things. You can read it on our website. And so the government took it quite seriously, and we have made a huge amount of changes in the last 2 years. The dramatic amount of sort of changes have been made in this. And as a result of which, in the latest financial year just finished, 23-24, we have done more than 1 lakh patents. So it's still less than one third of what the US does, but it is a 10 times increase in 7 years. And we are putting in place even more capacity. So, what I'm trying to tell you is that we have taken this whole IPR issue very, very seriously. And similar changes, by the way, have happened in copyright as well. But it started from a low base of only 3,000. Now it's 10 times larger at about 35 or 38,000 copyrights were also done last year. So point I'm making is that there's a dramatic increase in our capacity of dealing with IPR issues. Trademarks, we were always reasonably good. We were doing several lakh trademarks, but that also we can make it grow significantly because there's a bit of a backlog. So point I'm making is that we are now approaching in the next few years, certainly by 2030, become the single biggest, so not the single biggest, the third largest IPR generator in the world. And while I don't think we will have crossed the US and China just by 2030, but we will be in the same order of magnitude, and we will be larger than the rest. So, we will be a serious player in this space.
Zoom out a little bit now. All of this comes together in a particular way as India looks forward to becoming the third largest economy by the turn of the decade. Obviously, there are many concerns, some of whom we were pointed out. We need a better innovation system. You pointed out that we don't have enough hydrocarbons, so it makes perfect sense for us to move away from hydrocarbons. Water is going to be a big problem. Talk to us a little bit about, issues like water and pollution then. What are effective ways to channelize some of those, ideas of innovation to solve these problems. I mean, you and I both live in Delhi. Groundwater in Delhi is a big problem. Now, we are trying to build data centers, which will require a lot of energy, which will require a lot of water. Obviously, those things have to be addressed. I wonder what ideas you may be thinking of in, trying to address some of these problems.
So first of all, let me say that we won't be waiting for 2030 to become the world's third largest economy. In PPP terms, we are already there.
Yeah.
And this financial year, we will be about $4 trillion economy. And Japan's economy, thanks to the yen collapsing, it's only $4.1 trillion. So we are now within reach of becoming the fourth largest economy. And Germany is not far away. It's at $4.6 trillion. And it's not growing. So they are again within some 18 months away in terms of dollar terms, catching up with them. So by 2027, we will be the world's third largest economy. We are also, by some margin, the fastest growing economy. In fact, the main constraint to us for going even faster is no longer domestic reasons like infrastructure or whatever. It is now increasingly just the rest of the world. Unlike China, which had the benefit of a rapidly growing global economy, we don't. So most of this is having to be generated internally, which obviously makes it difficult. It also means that you have to keep a very sharp eye on macroeconomic bubbles building up anywhere, instability and anyway. And I said this many times before, if I have to accept a little bit slower growth in order to make sure our macro stability indicators remain robust, then I'm willing to take the hit. So where we are doing well. Now, obviously, there are other environmental and other issues that you raised about water and other things. It's a longer conversation, but let me say that we need to take a holistic view of this issue as well. For example, the biggest user of water is, in fact, agriculture. And a lot of the agriculture we do today is extremely wasteful, based on Green Revolution era technologies from the 1960s and 70s, which are not meaningful anymore. We can easily move away from them and create much more efficient uses of water. But then there needs to be a bigger conversation about how we run our agricultural system, what kind of reforms we need to do, and so on. And there has to be a public debate. If it becomes a political debate, it's difficult to get it done. But I think there needs to be a wider public debate on some things which are common sense in many ways.
I'm going to spend the next few minutes as we come towards wrapping up this conversation on your personal work also as an author. And especially your work in connecting India's unknown facets of India's history and bringing them up. One part of it was, revolutionary history. Talk to us a little bit about that. Are you doing more work on that space? Because there's a lot. Your book had a, very wide-arching view, and which was really interesting. But are you digging deeper on that, or are you moving on to other issues? Like you've been very interested in the Rakhigarhi digs, for instance, and a lot of new interesting timelines of Indian history is coming out through the Rakhigarhi digs. Are you getting interested in that? What are you working on?
So let me say that history book writing is a hobby. Much of the book writing that I do is actually an outcome of just keeping up with the history and finding out for my own entertainment, frankly. So I'm not doing this research for some future book. I may use it for some future book, but I'm not working in anyone. My primary interest right now is on keeping the economy on track. However, I'm doing one history-related project, which you may find interesting. I wrote the book some years ago called The Ocean of Churn, which was about the history of the Indian Ocean. And as a part of that research, I had talked about these ships called the stitch ships, these ancient designs. So what I'm doing is actually, I recreated a design of what a ship of that kind would be in the 5th century, in the Gupta period. And so it's partly based on literature, partly based on some depictions, like there's one depiction of a painting in Ajanta. There are other depictions as well, descriptions from other travelers and so on. And based on all of this, I'm now attempting to build such a ship with the support of the Ministry of Culture and the Indian Navy. And so this construction is already undergoing in a shipyard in Goa. And the idea is that once we get this, by this time next year, we should hopefully have it on the water and testing it out. And then once it is ready to roll, we intend to then sail it around. So the Honorable Prime Minister and His Excellency, the Sultan of Oman, have announced that the very first voyage of this ship will be to Muscat. So that is one. But I have a plan that maybe after that voyage, we will then attempt an even grander voyage from Kalinga to Indonesia and basically recreate the Bali Jatra.
The ancient trade routes, yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that you've chosen, Oman and Muscat, and of course the Kalinga route. Not a lot is known about these ancient trade routes, and one feels that, and you and I have had many conversations about this, that a lot more needs to be understood about a period of India's history when India really was a trading force. I mean, Indians have forgotten to think of ourselves as trading forces.
In fact, most of our history is
Doctor,
maritime.
that's right. That's right. It's all on the water. Talk to us a little bit about that. You began by talking a lot a few years ago about the Indian Ocean and how that could be reimagined. Are you doing more work there?
As I said, it's not directly part of my work. My work is much more oriented to running the economy. But as I said, this particular project on the Stitch ship is something that I am putting some time into because it will require building the ship, sailing it, testing it. It is an ancient ship. It has many characteristics, square sails, doesn't have a rudder. It uses a trailing oar, all these kinds of things. We don't know how the sailing characteristics of such a ship is in actual fact. So it's quite an experiment that we will be doing. So let that come out. It's a 21-meter long ship, so it's not a small ship. It's not a small boat. It's a reasonable size ship, and we intend to then sail it around and see what happens with it. So if you ask me if I'm doing something in the history space, this is the main thing that I'm now doing.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. And will people be actually be able to board that ship and travel with it?
Well, not passengers as such, because it's, let me warn you that people have romantic ideas about how it is to be on the ship. It is an ancient ship, so it doesn't have modern amenities.
That's right.
Anybody traveling on it would mean that you don't have bathed for several weeks. You are sleeping on a hammock which is bouncing around in the sea, and so on and so forth. And we don't know how it will behave in the middle of a storm. So, there are many people who have said, sign me up to sail in it, but I keep telling them, look, no, it's not what you think it is. It'll be horribly hot on the deck. There's
Right.
no air conditioning or any such thing.
And probably no toilets.
There are some toilets, but it'll be rudimentary stuff.
Rudimentary, yeah.
So we're not exactly the kind. It's not a luxury yacht.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. We look forward to that. Thank you very much for your time, Sanjeev Sanyal, talking about many of your ideas and the things you're doing. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks, Sanjeev.
Pleasure to talking to you as well.